Eric from Ontario, Canada asks, I enjoyed reading Crash Proof 2.0 and understand the book is mainly meant to help Americans protect themselves against a devalued US dollar. What would you advise Canadians to do? Would it simply be to invest in our own natural resources, buy Asian stocks, or to simply count our blessings and do nothing? Your book obviously recommends Euro-Pacific capitals, but who would you recommend to your friendly neighbors to the north to turn to provide such services?
Well, I'm glad that you asked that question, because when I wrote Crash Proof, I didn't own an interest in Euro-Pacific Canada. In fact, Euro-Pacific Canada didn't exist back then. It exists now. And so as a Canadian, you can do business with me up in Canada. We have 3 offices. We're in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And I do think that Canadians need to diversify. I think that Canadian investment should be included in the diversified portfolio, but I don't think that Canada will be immune to some of the problems here in the U.S., and there probably are more markets that might be more attractive and that might weather this storm even better. So you want to look abroad, and you can do that by contacting Euro-Pacific Canada. I think the website is europac.ca. Also, as a Canadian citizen, if you want to do business with my offshore bank, I have Euro-Pacific Bank and its subsidiary, Euro-Pacific International. Canadians can also do business with me there, and not only can they get global diversification, but we also have a bank where you can have a bank account, and more importantly, more uniquely, my new debit card, where you can hold your bank balance in gold and have a debit card that you can use to access that balance either through ATM cash withdrawals or through point of purchase sales. And in the meantime, your balance is kept in gold, but you can spend it almost as easily as you can spend Canadian dollars, US dollars, euros, whatever currency you generally bank in. So check out both Euro-Pacific Canada and Euro-Pacific Bank.
Eduardo from Sao Paulo, Brazil asks, how do you think the European crisis will affect the people of Brazil?
Well, I think the people in Brazil have more to worry about the Brazilian government than they do Europe. And I think all people around the world are worse off when people are squandering resources and labor is not being put to its highest and best use. I think the biggest problem for a lot of other countries is that they feel compelled to follow Europe down a self-destructive path. If you have countries such as Brazil that feel that they have to keep the real from rising in value because they feel they have to protect their competitive position vis-a-vis Europe or America, I think that causes inflationary policies to be pursued. But I think what people in Brazil need to focus on, and I was just down in Sao Paulo not too long ago, but they have to focus on their homegrown damage, things that the Brazilian government is doing with taxes and regulations that undermine the productivity of Brazilians. So I think if you can simply get your own house in order and rein in government, it's not really going to matter what happens in Europe. Brazil can thrive. Brazil puts the B in BRIC, and I think the emerging markets offer tremendous opportunities so long as they can refrain and resist the temptation of following the mistakes and the foolish policies of the West and simply continue to move with free market reforms of less government, more free enterprise, more capitalism, lower taxes, fewer regulations. If they simply stay on that path, they'll be prosperous.
John from Martinez, California asks, in my investment portfolio, I hold a pretty substantial position in energy-based royalty trusts, which mostly hold the rights to reserves in crude oil. Do you think that I should start selling some of my positions in these trusts, or will this be a good place to be if the economy takes the turn that you are predicting?
Well, I don't know exactly, which trusts you own or what percentage of your overall net worth is comprised of those trusts. Maybe you want to talk to one of the Euro-Pacific capital brokers personally, but I own quite a few of these trusts. I'm not selling them. I'm just collecting the income that they pay, the dividends that they pay. And if I'm right about the nature of the next collapse, if it is a currency collapse, a dollar collapse, a sovereign debt crisis in America, I think that those trusts will do very well. If, on the other hand, I'm wrong, if we get a repeat of the 2008 type of collapse, well, you remember how much those trusts got beaten up in 2008. The same thing might happen again. So it depends on the nature of the next collapse. Of course, if there is no collapse at all, if the global economies keep on growing, then I would still expect you to do very well in those trusts, because I do believe that demand for oil will keep rising, which means the price will keep going up, which means the dividends will keep flowing. But anyway, again, talk specifically with one of my brokers at Euro Pacific Capital regarding your unique situation as to whether or not you should make any changes to your portfolio.
Ed from Baytown, Texas asks, does corporate personhood violate our individual constitutional rights?
If I understand your question, I think you're asking me, does a corporation, is the existence of a corporation as a person, or being viewed as a person, somehow violative of the Constitution? And the answer would be no. I mean, the right to incorporate, I think, is inherent in the rights that we have. If you're an individual, you have a right to form a business. If you own property, and you have the right to private property, if you want to organize that property in a corporation, then that's your right to do. And really, the corporation is an extension of the individual, and it does have an identity separate from the individual who created it, or the group of individuals who create it. But a corporation is generally a collection of individuals who have rights, and they pass those rights to the corporation, and the corporation is the property of those individuals and therefore has rights. It doesn't have identical rights. I mean, the corporation doesn't vote in an election. The individual shareholders get to vote. They don't get to vote again as a corporation. But the same private property rights that I have as a citizen, I have as a shareholder, and all those protections of due process apply. The difference is, when you create a corporation, you do create a separate and distinct legal entity, but you're creating it based on the rights that you already have as an individual, and those rights are passing from the individuals to the corporation. But nothing about that process would somehow violate the Constitution. In fact, what the Constitution is written for is to limit the power of government. It's not written to limit the power of the individual. We retain our powers. We simply created a government of limited powers, and those powers are defined and limited by the Constitution. Unfortunately, most of our elected leaders don't understand this, and our judges don't enforce it.
Marlon from Tucson, Arizona asks, I am currently attending a junior college, and I will be attending a university next year. I will be pursuing a degree in economics. How much math is involved in obtaining this type of degree? Any information and advice will be greatly appreciated.
I'm assuming maybe you're asking the question because you don't like math, or you're not good at math. I mean, there is some math in economics depending on the courses you take. In fact, there is some calculus in economics, but only rudimentary. So in order to do any of the math that is involved in economics, I mean, you really don't have to be a mathematician. You don't have to double major in math, but it does make sense to understand math. I mean, if you're looking at, you're going to study a lot of these charts, and you're going to see, there are curves that are created, and you can extrapolate the curves based on math and based on calculus. But you don't really have to understand calculus that well to grasp economics. In fact, I think that economics is mainly common sense. The problem is, most of what you learn is counter to that common sense. I think economics is a science. I don't think it's a philosophy. I think there is a hard science that you can understand causes and effects, and there are rules, laws of economics, just like there are laws of physics or chemistry. And unfortunately, the way it's taught in universities today, it's almost like it's just a philosophy, right? And that you can have different schools of thought, and nobody is wrong and nobody is right, and it's all up for debate, as if it's all politics, and it's not. And I think a lot of the departments, the universities that teach it, are abandoning real economic principles because they don't like them. I mean, they want to pretend that economists can make our lives better by trying to micromanage policy, government policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy. So keep that in mind. I mean, don't worry about the math. You can study economics. What I'm more worried about is the indoctrination process, is learning Keynesianism, learning almost the whole science or the whole discipline of macroeconomics can go out the, throw it away. I mean, if you have a micro course and you're learning about that, there's a lot of relevance in the microeconomics, and there's some important principles and concepts that you can grasp. But when it comes to macro stuff, take it with a grain of salt. Maybe just learn how the other people think so you can argue with them and refute them, and just study a lot on your own. Read the Austrian school, right? Read Mises and Rothbard and Hayek. Read my stuff, maybe read my dad's stuff. Read Henry Hazlitt. I mean, there's books out there. And there's some, there's modern books too. Check out my reading list. I know I haven't updated it recently. I probably have to do that, but I've got a reading list on my website at europac.net. Check out some of those books and learn real economics too, alongside of what you learn in college. Remember, I took econ courses at UC Berkeley, so you can imagine the kind of nonsense I was spoon-fed over there. Yet I still came out of that university with my head on straight because I learned from my dad and I did outside reading. So I would suggest you do the same thing.